We are live with Alexander Bard, and we are going to be discussing tribal singularity. Tribal singularity may at first seem like a strange notion or a strange concept. Of course, it brings together two concepts which might appear antithetical to one another. On the one hand, the tribe, which gives images of our prehistoric past, of primordial human interaction. And on the other hand, the singularity is often connected to either an advanced scientific concept or an advanced mathematical concept, which has been evoked in technological and scientific circles about a future technological singularity, a point in time where technology is advancing so quickly that human beings are simply obsolete, unneeded. And I want to bring these two concepts together, basically, because my impression of the technological singularity literature is that it was very disconnected from real human sciences and from philosophy, and it really left us with, interesting visions of potential future possibilities and future technologies, but it didn't leave us with a deep anthropology or a deep philosophy of how we should approach singularity from a human perspective. How are we as human beings in the next few decades going to organize our societies in a world that's vastly different from any historical epoch, and technology is obviously a main actor and a main player in that process. But it leaves us with questions, I think, of a phenomenological nature, leaves us with questions of an anthropological nature. So I wanted to bring on Alexander Bard. He can introduce himself because he is a theorist of technology. He is a philosopher of technology. And I think that he has a project, tribal mapping project, which might be of deep relevance to these conversations. So Bard, welcome. And
thank you for having me.
Let's dance.
Yes, okay. Historically speaking, we appear to have lived as human beings for about 60 to 70,000 years in what we could roughly call the original tribe. It's also called the sociont these days. There's even a whole new science here coming out of data anthropology called sociontology. And this is a study of what the original tribe could have looked like. This original tribe, the sociont, was universal. It doesn't matter what climate zone you look at. It operated pretty much according to the same patterns. So you could study today among tribes, for example, among the Inuits in Canada or in Brazil, in the jungle, or in New Guinea, or anywhere you go on the planet, you find very similar patterns. So the sociont, there's a famous number called the Dunbar number here. It's actually almost exactly 157. But we usually call it the clan. So the clan is a smaller size within the tribe that's larger than family. So if you have, say, a family size, the most close date, you go towards clan size, and then you could go all the way up to tribe size, which is probably something more like 1,200 to 1,500 grown-ups with some children to go along with them. So this is a form that we lived in for, 70,000 years at least. And if we count civilization, the last 10,000 years, even more than that. This is a form we lived in for a very long time. So evolutionarily speaking, this has shaped us. That means we genetically are shaped by this period. What's also important then to stress is that within the sociont, this is where all anthropologists agree, the shared worldview was one called the eternal return of the same. We call it nomadology in our work. We take this term from Gilles Deleuze. Nomadology means that, it's a new year, but it's the same year anyway. It's a new day, but it's the same day anyway. Everything is constantly repeated. And there cannot really be any dramatic changes. The sun goes up, the sun goes down. So it's all circular time. There's no point to speak about linear time once you live within the sociont and a nomadological realm. And for example, Hinduism is a major religion of the world today in the worldview that still has this worldview. It's still nomadological. Now, the question is then, how does this idea of singularity come about? Well, it's actually called the event in the world of philosophy. Alain Badiou has written a lot about it, for example. But the event is something that, for example, all the Abrahamic religions are built on. And before them, Zoroastrianism, and I'm a converted Zoroastrian, and I'm a philosopher within that tradition. So the question is, when did that happen? It turns out about 4,000 years ago, in Persia, that was connecting China and India, Persia broke off from China and India by introducing this idea of eventology. And eventology means that you could have a worldview where something radical can happen that changes history forever. So there's no going back after that point in time. That needs linear time. It also needs a society of written language for that to be possible, because it needs information accumulation. The whole idea that the world could be different, that the son could create a world different from the father, the daughter could live in a world different from the mother, that idea can only exist in a society of rapid change in itself. So the change would happen first. And obviously with the information accumulation that comes with written language and the invention of permanent settlements, it would have to be within a culture of permanent settlements. You come up with this idea that, oh, wait a second, we're not moving constantly any longer to survive. So we can actually have a growing population. We can change the world forever. The world is no longer what it used to be. The fact that we've settled, the fact we've started storing information outside of our own brains radically changes everything. So this is the first clear event in human history that breaks with the nomadological loop. And this is the innovation of linear time. And the pointer is to keep in mind that circular time is still there. We still wake up every morning, and every day is different from the day before, but it's still the same day. Every year is different from the year before, still the same year. But with eventology, there's the possibility of a day that suddenly changes everything, or a year that suddenly changes everything. And this idea is essentially what the West became. With the Persians, I always say the West is anything west of the Gobi Desert. It's not China, it's not India, it's not Japan. That's the East. But with the Persians, and eventually with the Arabs and with the Europeans and everybody else, and the traditions we've had in the West, eventually that became Europe over the last 400 years, eventology has been the dominant mode of our thinking. But I always propose we should think in both ways. What is Hegel does that, for example. What is dangerous when we try to separate eventology from nomadology, because then we move into Gnosticism and all kinds of errors that we've done over the last 3,000 years. And most of the problems with the West, I would refer to an idea that you can be eventological without being nomadological. And that, I think, is dangerous. So that's the sociont for you. Right. The sociont then is the first singularity, it's the tribal singularity. But it doesn't understand that it's a singularity. It's only after the sociont has stopped moving and becomes an event in the permanent settlement that it starts to think of the world as eventological.
All right. So what I take away from what you're saying then is that before written history, before agricultural settlements, we're living in a circular time because there's nothing we observe which gives us any sort of signal or gives us any reason to believe in a radical rupture, to believe in a discontinuous break.
Exactly. So this is paganism. This is paganism or right. Hinduism today. Yes.
Right. And then you have circular time, which is linked to our hunter-gatherer existence, which makes sense for the seasons, which makes sense for the life cycle as we observe it. And then with civilization, we have a new reason to believe that something different can emerge, something radically other, something that changes the previous notion of the historical process. And exactly. then there are some minds who think that they can sort of prophesize an event which would take away the eternal return of the same.
Yes. So paganism is, for example, summer solstice, winter solstice, spring solstice, fall. You know, it's just this idea that the seasons determine everything in the calendar. That is essentially a circular calendar. But when eventology arrives, there can be birthdays, there can be death dates, there can be people you celebrate that are way more important than any of these solstices. And that's a clear sign that eventology has entered history. So the idea of civilization is eventological. There can be no civilization in a nomadological world. There can only be society as a whole, and it's fundamentally tribal. So the only way you could think of something that's bigger than tribes, larger than tribes, would have to be a form of civilization. Now, here's the problem, though. This is the catch, and why I deeply respect nomadology, is that we haven't been shaped at all evolutionarily by this period of eventology. It's only existed, and minorly so, only gradually grown over the last 4,000 years. 4,000 years have very little effect on our genes. So the genetic heritage we have as human beings is deeply tribal and nomadological. But the mimetic heritage we have, the world of ideas ever since, and this, of course, something that philosophers are obsessed with, has come out of Eventology. And eventually also the Eventology of the West has influenced the philosophy of the East gradually. So when the East started building empires and nations and things like that and tried to model them, they essentially mimicked the West, although they stayed within a nomadological realm.
Well, in our hunter-gatherer past, say we lived in tribes of 150, 250, in the area of the Dunbar number, and we lived obviously without walls. We lived without separation. We didn't have our own rooms. We didn't have our own little private bedrooms. We were living in a tribe, and we were living with other people. And even the notion, I am an individual, was probably foreign to people who grew up and never were separated from their tribe.
Oh, it still is in the East. That's the point. If you're an Indian or a Chinese, you don't believe in individualism.
Right.
It's not about you. It's about family, clan, and you're only a clog in that machine. It's just like you're not. Individualism is essentially a European idea. It was developed out of Christianity. It arrived with the Enlightenment in the 17th century. And I think it's basically failed because it's not the way human beings operate. Human beings are fundamentally tribal. And if you want to create some kind of a humane society, you got to start with the tribal size. I call this tribal poesis. I think anything else that we discuss when it comes to being human, I think is a mistake. Individuals are polar bears, for example. They operate as solitary animals. They operate on their own. But the idea that human beings are polar bears, I think, is ridiculous. When you look at the larger social map, it's just not the way human beings operate. And that's, for example, why we have congregations, we have communities, we have all these kinds of different things that back us up when we try to achieve anything in the world, because without that community, we can't operate.
Right. And at the same time, the notion of the individual is something that emerged in civilization. It became enhanced and exaggerated in modernity and Enlightenment philosophy, and it continues to exert a force and an efficacy that has put us into, what many critical theorists would call the neoliberal era, where we're in an era in individualism, we're in an era of isolated capitalism, we're in an era where the old family structures don't work anymore, we're in an era where the marriage rates are declining and divorce rates are rising. There's a feeling of social tension. There's a feeling of social anxiety, which for many people, I think even myself included, feel overwhelmed by, and we don't know how to move. For example, in terms of as a philosopher, I want to start with my concrete embodied existence in some sense. I live in a room by myself. My relationships with family, relationships with women are not necessarily stable. Friend networks are mostly online. There's a sense in which tribe is something that's calling me. There's a sense in which tribe is, I think, calling a lot of people. But at the same time, there seems to be this huge, I would say, epistemological difficulty with knowing how to do tribe well. How do we map tribe? How do we build community in a way that we don't run into, pathological modes of identification? Here, issues with the unconscious for me are front and center, issues with over-attachment, under-attachment, where do you get love? All these problems seem to be emerging in a very radical way. So as we think about notions like tribopoesis, which is, I think, a very innovative notion from the word autopoiesis, how do we approach this? Because yes, we're tribal, but the tribal environment we were in the past didn't have artificial intelligence and magical screens where we could talk to each other in between Sweden and London, So it seems like we're in a radically new environment. We are, at the same time needing to cultivate for our own psychological sanity some sort of tribal, that we're all in the same boat, that we're all in this together. But how do we do that in an authentic way? How do we approach a tribal mapping project?
I think they're called subcultures, but I just want to go back first to finish off individualism. It was never a freedom project. Individualism was something that came out of the function of the law. And the law became necessary when we moved to larger sizes, larger populations in the tribe. And due to permanent settlements and eventually the building of towns and cities, we had to invent formats like the city, the nation, and eventually the empire. And these larger formats do not supply us with a sort of loyalty to the community that the tribe does. In the tribe, basically, you go up against the elders, and the elders will cut you short if you don't understand what they're up to, because they have wisdom and they can survive in an environment that you can't when you're young. So the elders will basically tell you, these are your limits, and with those limits, you will grow into your archetype. You will become the kind of person you could become. This is how you will contribute to the tribe. So they would give you contribution as a principle, which is what's lacking today. Now, individualism then is required by the law because we can't punish whole populations. So we have to lock up each criminal one by one. And the way you lock up the criminals, you take the body and you lock up the body. Michel Foucault has gone through this historically very well. So you lock up the individual human body, and that's where individualism starts. It doesn't start as a freedom project. It starts like a product of, okay, we got to take this specific individual. And this comes then into Judaism and eventually into Christianity and Islam, that it's each individual who goes to heaven or goes to hell. So you will have your whole life summarized eventually. You will only meet the elder when you die, and it'll be St. Peter or something like that. And that starts the distortion compared to the tribal map that people actually are used to before that. And this, of course, gradually happens. Philosophers don't really see it happening. And it's nice to, be able to pick out the guy who's the bad guy out of the tribe or out of the community and put him in a prison. That is where individualism starts. It starts for you being responsible towards the monotheistic gods for your own acts, because that's how you control larger populations. It's the only way you can do that. But if you go back to the tribe itself, then within the tribe, you have archetypes. Now, I use that in a classical sense, not necessarily the Jungian sense. I talk about archetypes like that's your personality type. That's eventually could be your profession. This is how you specialize. This is how you contribute to the community as a whole, as a woman or a man or anything else. And I think it's interesting now with data that we can actually start to map the original tribe, the Sosant, and see where women and men and androgynous people, everybody else, fits into the larger whole and how to contribute to the community. And then we discovered that all these things that we're obsessed with today, like race and sexual orientation, these things, they're only secondary byproducts of the archetypes. So this is called archetypology. We'll work with that. So archetypology is like a new Aristotelian science to try to figure out what kind of people are there and how do they respectively contribute to the community. And since, we haven't really changed the 4,000 years, you can more or less say that human beings are the constant when we try to map this. Whereas technology obviously soon becomes the variable, and it's now exploding as a variable. So, right. So we're at the stage where individualism ends up as narcissism. It was bound to end up at nothing but massive hyper narcissism, and that is the end state, at least the end state of individualism.
All right. So there's many things that you said there that I want to touch on. And in some sense, when I hear your project, I see what you're doing as kind of a continuation and an extension of where Jordan Peterson's metaphysics kind of fall apart, because Jordan Peterson is emphasizing the individual, and Jordan Peterson is sort of emphasizing a return to individualism, and like with that the notion of clean up your room and get your act together type of thing, like putting it on individual duty, individual responsibility. And in some sense, you're doing the opposite of that, because I know, for example, you've said if Nietzsche says God is dead, I'm saying the individual is dead. And I wanted to touch on this notion that in the tribe, where you would get your identity is with limits from the elders, and this notion of limitation, because I feel like in our current society and on our current climate, there's this inability to know where the limit is, and to sort of on the naive end, think that you're limitless. So, for example, even in the Kurzweilian fantasy, there's this notion of that you're limitless, like that eventually that you're just going to be able to escape into a limitless reality that just expands forever. Whereas, this notion of death is as an ultimate limit has kind of evaporated. And whereas in the previous societies, death, I always say death would kind of be everywhere. You would see death everywhere. You would know that there's this limit. And in the technological singularity fantasy, you have this fantasy of immortality, that you're going to live forever, that you're going to have the end of death. So I just want to emphasize the importance of this concept of limit, and that I think my generation is struggling to know, and I think unconsciously attempting to detect, where is the limit, through shit tests, through hysterical provocations. I think the mechanism of hysterical provocation is this testing of the phallus, like, where is the limit? Show me where the limit is. It's like calling for elders. And I just want to bring up this other aspect that you were touched on, which I think is another crucial extension of a limit in Peterson, which is that race and gender are secondary archetypes. They're not primary archetypes. And at the same time, there's something very interesting in the SJWs, because they are looking for tribe. But they're like, here's the question I want to throw at you, is that the SJWs are looking for tribe, but they might be looking for tribe in the wrong way, because they're looking for tribe through race. They're looking for tribe through gender. So they're not able to get identity from limitation.
Yeah, it's all Gnosticism. That's what unites Ray Kurzweil and the SJWs. And they're on the wrong path, both of them. Gnosticism started in a big way in the Persian Empire. So that's like 200, 300 years after Christ really exploded, through Manichaeism that eventually influenced Christianity through St. Augustine, and Mazdaism, which is essentially the basis for Islam. And this is, to me, according to me, the problems of Christianity and Islam. And when Jordan Peterson tries to stay within the Christian realm, he's kind of betraying his own Nietzschean roots, and he's going back to becoming a Kantian moralist. But let's leave Jordan aside as kind of an ally on the way anyway. He has shortcomings, clearly, and he will not succeed in his project. But let's look at Kurzweil and SJW, because it's more interesting to see their similarities. So the Gnostic is essentially a person who hates sexuality and hates the body and goes high on his own mind. He separates the nomadological, the sort of circle which the body represents, and goes completely into the ontological and takes the nomadological out. So it's essentially an 11-year-old boy who refuses to grow up. This is Ray Kurzweil as a person, clearly. This is most of Silicon Valley. This is Mark Zuckerberg syndrome, if anything. So these guys go completely into logos of zeros and ones, and they believe in it, and they don't see that pathos exists. It's like try to hide sexuality, try to hide violence, and get out of those things. This is why they often go towards pacifism and vegetarianism, which is, of course, also what the HJWs do. Now, the problem with that is that Gnosticism is a horrible fantasy in the sense that it hasn't properly thought through what it claims to aim for. It aims for perfection. Well, perfection is death, because if something is perfect, it can no longer change, because then it becomes imperfect. It aims for infinity. Well, infinity in this sort of vulgar sense, as Hegel would say, is ultimate horror, because if everything was infinite, there wouldn't be anything that meant anything within that infinity. Finitude is what gives meaning. Limitations gives meaning. Constraints makes creativity possible. It's impossible without it. And then, of course, at the end of the day, it's an 11-year-old boy who, precisely by not growing up, refuses to take the next step in his lifetime, in his history, meaning he doesn't want to die at all. And he then starts dreaming about immortality. And that's exactly why these religions like Christianity and Islam, who claim that there's a heaven, cannot portray heaven in their text, because it becomes totally banal and vulgar. It becomes like an 11-year-old's dream of a perfect paradise where nothing is ever regenerated, where there's no sexuality any longer, there's no violence, there's no force anywhere. It's like a perfect world for a little boy to show up to his mother to make her happy and give him a gold star. It's infantile, right? And this is my problem with Plato. We've had the problem ever since this happened. And of course, the Gnostics took on to Plato, vulgarized him even further. But the problem we've had with the West ever since the axial age has been this cult of infantility, this cult to perfection, infinity, and immortality, that when you think through those ideas are absolutely absurd and, of course, horrible. Any vampire novel will expose the horrors of having to live forever. That's the truth.
So let me ask a further, you're trying to say, let's push towards the similarities between Kurzweil and SJWs. Let me ask a question, because so I'm totally on board that in let's call it the Silicon Valley cult.
Yeah.
in the Silicon Valley cult, it does resemble a perfect world for little boys. And it does sort of resemble this a naive masculine fantasy of a world where, you could say the phallus has triumphed completely, and that there's sort of...
Well, it's a pseudo-phallus, clearly.
I know, it's a pseudo-phallus.
It's a very small penis and a very small boy. Absolutely, yes.
It's an image of this transcendence where, the boy gets what he wants,
Yeah, to impress his mom, not to, for example, please a woman, which is what a grown-up man would look for. He's still tied to the mom. He's still tied to the mamilla. He's still tied to the tit. And this is where the similarities with SJWs come into the picture. They're also infantile. In what way? They're a pagan lynch mob with infantile motives. That means the only way to unite the SJWs when they run around with the bitterness in the streets is to claim essentially that nothing is our fault. So this is the opposite, the inverted Gnosticism. This is a body that denies the mind completely, and it goes to its feelings, and it's all about its feelings. And those feelings are feelings of frustration, and the only way to get out of frustration is to blame somebody else for all your shortcomings. And that's essentially why the SJWs, their only political solution is to tax anybody with money 100%, and then take the money and give it to the SJWs. That's the only political motive they have.
Right, but I wanted to ask: does the SJWs and their fantasy resemble a more feminine structure? Like, whereas
no, it's not. It's infantile. It's girlish. It's not feminine, because feminine for me, grown-up women. I saw, for example, today Candace Owens having a Zimbabwean African immigrant woman who had been successful in the United States for a guest. And this conversation between Candace and this Zimbabwean African woman, I can't remember her name right now, but she's stunning. And she'd made it in America. She was one of these people who believed in the American dream, moved to America, worked hard and made it. And now she's raised a family with 3 kids and she's highly successful. Now, these 2 women are sick and tired of being called racist and white supremacist. They're proud Black women. These accusations they get from SJWs are absolutely ridiculous. But these women expose the flaw of the SJWs. The flaw is that these are nothing but a victimhood cult running around in the streets, claiming all kinds of silly things that are completely self-contradictory. And at the end of the day, all they want to do is to be children and have somebody else pay their bills. That is being stuck to the mamilla. This again where it reminds me of Ray Kurzweil. It's still stuck to the mamilla, still stuck to the breast. It should have left a long time ago, but it's stuck to the breast, and this breast financially supports you with all your crazy ideas. That is where the SJWs and the Kurzweils are similar. They're 2 different versions of Gnosticism. Both of them have decided to split the body and the mind, separate them and only go for one of them. And the SJWs then only talk about their feelings, their pathos, with no logos at all. That's why everything they claim is completely contradictory. And they take no responsibility for that because it's not their fault. Whereas the Silicon Valley nerds are stuck with the logos and they don't like the pathos, want to get out of the way, and they think they can just through intelligence create the perfect world. Well, the problem with that is that there's no flow to intelligence in itself. It has no energy. It has no blood. It doesn't even have electricity in itself. It's just stuck permanently, zeros and ones. And that's why they can believe in these crazy ideas like uploading. You can't do uploading. It's impossible. You cannot upload your personality because your personality is full of all these things that have nothing to do with zeros and ones. And they don't get it.
It seems to me then that the only way out and the only way towards something like a tribal singularity is for first men to take responsibility for their body primarily, and to understand their body, to integrate their intelligence with their body, and to use their intelligence in relationship to their immediate embodied existence and its extension with the social, the relationship with other men first and foremost, and then the relationship with women secondarily, where you can help the woman move through her emotions with the immanence of her body. And then there's the possibility for tribe. And then that would both fulfill the quest of the SJW's emotional drive, which is for tribe, and also fulfill the tech Silicon Valley drive, which is this will to transcendence through intelligence, but it would be a will to transcendence through intelligence that was fully embodied. and still capable of moving in this totally new landscape, which is filled with new technologies and new possibilities and new otherness.
Yeah, but I don't believe the SJWs want the tribe. I think they want the lynch mob. They know nothing better. Because if you're stuck with a nomadology, you very soon take this idea of eternal revolution. Since everything is the same, that is constantly repeated, you end up with Mao Zedong's cultural revolution. That's what happened if you take an eventological idea, which is a revolution, everything has changed, and throw it into a nomadological society. The worst form of it was, of course, Pol Pot's Cambodia. The problem was that the Chinese and the Cambodians mimicked something that could possibly make sense in a mythological culture, which, for example, was Europe or Russia. But when it came to nomadological culture, it became the cultural revolution. And it ended up as eternal revolution, Trotsky's idea of the eternal revolution. This is a guy who's so hooked on revolutions that it's become a kick that he's seeking all the time. This is the ultimate abuser of substances, right? Trotsky. And then Mao picked up on that because that made sense to him in China, because that's how he kept his power. If there was to be a revolution, it had to be eternally repeated. Now, that was the tragedy of East Asia in the 20th century. And I think it's important to remind ourselves that if the SJWs are going for a tribe, no, they're not seeking a tribe. They're seeking something similar to tribe, but because they're not prepared to take the responsibility of a tribe, which is that I want to grow up one day. I want to stop being a boy and becoming a man. I want to grow up one day. I want to stop being a girl and become a proper woman. And I want to go into the sexual realm. And I want to understand what violence does to people. I want to go into the pathical realm. And I want to be fully embodied as that, which is the proper response. But you can't do that if you're an SJW, because you're basically denied all that already. You denied all that right by claiming you can only be feelings that cannot think properly. So they end up as lynch mobs, and the lynch mobs never tire of finding new victims. And the way the lynch mobs go after the bits like Nazism, you go after everybody until you go after yourself, and then the only thing left is to kill yourself. And before that, the youth killed their parents. Look at China in the 1960s, 1970s. One of the most horrible ideas ever took root and led to one of the biggest tragedies we ever saw. And this exactly is sort of apocalyptic movements we have seen and will increasingly see if we don't come aware of the origin of Gnosticism and the problem of eventology crushing into nomadology, and how we can finally solve the issue of how we relate the nomadological to the eventological. And to me, that is society that has to embrace both. Otherwise, it won't work.
So I agree with you that the SJW is not able to handle tribe, but I think there is an unconscious impulse there. And I think that you see that, for example, in all the anarchist movements and squats, and like that usually the SJWs have at least communism as an ideology. So there's an unconscious impulse, but there is like absolutely no capacity to really embody tribe, or I don't really think that they could take responsibility for the consequence of tribe. What would it look like basically if a man my age, or the guys I'm around and the people I relate with, if we were to accept both nomadology and eventology, what would that look like? You say, would it be like our own little weird subculture? Like,
it would be subcultures, but the problem is the lynch mobs and the tribes are both subcultures. Only the tribes last much longer and are much more constructive. So this is the problem. If you want to belong to a tribe, you want to grow up. That's the point of being in the tribe. The phallic intrusion happens at 1 year of age. This is something that psychologists, psychoanalysts, and psychiatrists all agree on. The phallic intrusion means that you finally have this impulse to leave the mamula. You have teeth growing in your mouth. The phallus walks by, and the only thing the male body represents, according to Freud and according to Julia Kristeva and any other psychoanalyst you talk to, is that represents what's different from the mother's body that you must leave. So that's what you can aspire towards, to be grown up. So the way you use the male body in your psyche, since the female body is where you come from, you come out of the matrix and you get to the mamula, you stay in the mamula at 1 year of age. It's the first impulse, it's called the phallic intrusion. And with the phallic intrusion, you have this instinct. You want to be like that. You want to grow up. You want to be a woman or a man. And then your entire childhood is supposed to be this play where you're playing and mimicking the grown-ups to one day become like them. And you're eager to be one of them. And you go through your teenage years and your body adultifies. And that is the signal that you must, in your mind, also adultify. And a few years after you started going into teenage adolescence, you go through the rite of passage. In any tribe I've studied, you're maybe somewhere between 18 and 20 years old. You go through rite of passage, and you proudly now declared a young man or a young woman. This is your next journey. This is a journey through adulthood towards possibly becoming an elder. And beyond that, possibly becoming priestly or shamanic, and possibly even beyond that, becoming divine, which means you become an ur-father or an ur-mother for a future tribe that will look up to you as somebody who really achieved something in your life. This is nomadology. This is what it means to belong to a tribe. Now, if you don't want to grow up because the phallic intrusion has failed and everybody has told you while you grow up that you could be a child forever because somebody else would pay your bills and somebody else who was heavily taxed would pay everything for you, and you do not have to take responsibility for yourself or the people you love, because you can always blame your mistakes and shortcomings on somebody else. Now, that's hysteria. But that's what I see in the SJWs. I don't see them taking responsibility for themselves. They want to raise statues of drug addicts who've died. It's completely dysfunctional. Any previous culture would have seen this is insane. You raise statues of heroes. You might discover afterwards they weren't that heroic. You might then put another statue next to them and keep them in your history as a warning sign, and then put another statue of something you find is heroic. But human beings must be in the heroic mode. And if we're not in the heroic mode, we lose track of absolutely everything. And this is what I'm scared of today in the West, is that we're going into this sort of apocalyptic mode where everybody blames everything in their lives on anybody else and takes no responsibility any longer. And I don't see the SJWs take responsibility for themselves today whatsoever. They're white liberal kids who attack black women for being racist. Do you realize how deranged this has gotten now? Now, I don't think that's a nice place at all to be in. I think this is very much like the Chinese Cultural Revolution, and it's now striking in America, and it's taking over all the old institutions like academics, it's moving into politics, and it's running amok in old industry as well. And the marketing department these days tries to be woke, and I think they're on the wrong path, and they're going to pay a very heavy price when they discover actually what they're doing.
All right. Well, let's maybe shift focus from the SJWs and talk about this phallic intrusion, where there's this inspiration to grow up, where there's this inspiration to accept either becoming a man or a woman and walking this path towards ultimately becoming potentially an elder, or for some people, priestly or shamanic, or the Ur-father and the Ur-mother. Of course, for most people, there's going to be the capacity to become a father or a mother, but there's also going to be a small number of people who want to be outside of those categories, and I think that would be the shamanic caste, or it would be the more androgynous caste. So how do you see this process taking place? How do people find out, through this process of the phallic intrusion, where they are going to situate themselves vis-a-vis the phallus, basically?
Yeah, so we go through university education, and we get professional things like that pretty much at the same time when you in the tribe went up to the elders and they recommended where you should go next, and probably gave you an older mentor to guide you. It would be an uncle or an aunt, something like that, who would guide you towards the archetype that you could really be. So these things are deeply biological in us. And the way it worked in the tribe, the original tribe, is that you had a central circuit called the inner circuit. This was a matriarchy. This is dominated by the older women, and the oldest woman of the tribe would be the ultimate deliverer station that everybody else in the tribe was responsible to. Matriarchy and patriarchy were equally strong, and they are in most cultures originally. So this was the matriarchy. Then you had a patriarchy, or an outer circuit, that consisted of the majority of men. This is where the warfare and the hunting and all those things went on. Whereas of course, the inner circuit is the center of the reproduction and taking care of the old people, because you needed them because they had all the wisdom. So that was very much the inner circuit. Matriarchy, patriarchy. Now, in between those two, you have a borderline. You have people to go in between, because sexuality tends to sort of make women more female over time and make men more male over time to encourage the sexual attraction. So you need more and more go-betweens in between. And these are the androgynous people. So for example, the people we talk about today as gays and lesbians and trannies or whatever, these are very much the androgynous people. They're go-betweens. These are the men who go into the inner circuit. These are the women who go out into the outer circuit. And whatever sexual orientations they have is usually byproduct of those roles. So these are other archetypes that are important, but they're a small minority. When we've done the data, we discovered they're about 4% of the population. So this is, again, why the whole LGBT movement, when it started to have these sort of, that all of society should try to be more queer or whatever, they got it all wrong. No. This is for the LGBT movement to be proud about, because they are needed as the go-betweens between the inner and the outer circuit in any society. And that's exactly how they live their lives. So you look at their professions and things like that. But then you have the shamanoid characters. They're another 4% of the total population. So that's a small minority again, but they're at the very outskirts of everything. They're outside of the outer circuit. The men and women who live there are kind of wild and crazy, this is where you find the whorehouses of history, and you find the trade routes of history there, certainly eventually. And you certainly find any seaport with all these sleazy bars and nightclubs and things like that. These are the shamanoids. And the shamanoids are like crazy and wild in normal circumstances, but they are the most sound and reasonable people when you're in a crisis. So who are they then? Well, they're the go-betweens between the tribe and other tribes. Jared Diamond and these sort of vulgar historians have sort of said that tribes were in constant war for one another. Well, it turns out that's not historically correct. It would be very costly to be at war at all times. No, the shamanoids were the ones who did all the communication with the outside world. That means both horizontal communication, which is direct communication with other tribes. And I've seen it. I've been in New Guinea in the middle of the battlefields, and I've seen these guys just walk straight through the battlefield, and nobody sends any arrows their way because they're shamans. They go in between tribes. That's how they function in any tribal society I've studied. And that's what they do all the time. They're women and they're men, and they call it kind of wild and crazy, but they go in between tribes all the time. But they, of course, also handle vertical communication. That means if you're going to talk to God and, ask for protection or ask for any favors or whatever, you go and see the shamans. So this is where counseling and therapy and these things also starts in history. And of course, the modern equivalent to that would be psychoanalysts. Because the psychoanalyst is essentially a shamanoid personality you go to, who then sort of works through language and images and things to get to the deepest of your own conscious, and then get out of that how you actually operate.
Right. So most in your theory of the formation of the tribe, let's say boys and girls start out kind of androgynous. They haven't reached the genital maturation stage. They haven't yet become man. They haven't yet become woman, but there's some process. They're tied to the mother. They're maybe tied to the mother in some structurally similar way due to the fact that they're both born. But then there's the phallic intrusion and this sense of, I want to grow up. And then you have a certain percentage of the population becoming men and identifying as men, a certain percentage of the population becoming women, identifying as women. And then you have this crucial bridge between the true of the androgynous, which I always felt as kind of one of the reasons why men and women are sort of in such tension with each other, is because there is kind of this inability to form a bridge between the masculine and the feminine. And how do we bring it to consciousness that as a part of every tribe, we need to sort of have some people on the masculine end, some people on the feminine end, and some people as a go-between between these two realms? Is it just through talking raw and talking honestly about how we experience embodied sexuality?
Well, I think people naturally go to these forms, these archetypes.
But there's a problem of links. There's a problem of linking symptoms. It's not like what you're saying, I agree with, but there's an inability to bring this to consciousness, to make the link that I'm identifying in this way sexually, and this puts me in this weird androgynous gendered position, and that means I'm kind of a crucial go-between. Like, for example, like you'd see in the initial LGBT movement, more of a desire to conform with heteronormativity, like, for example, demanding marriage equality. overseeing themselves as some sort of weird
Yes,
androgynous
but that
bridge.
has a very significant historical reason. Gay men died in droves between 1984 and 1992. It was the second Holocaust. It was AIDS. And just go to Broadway and see how tacky and horrible the Broadway plays are these days. They're the same old plays all over again, and they're no longer relevant to the times we live in because all the talented gay guys died. What was left was just, Team B. And they were very much activists and politically engaged. But all the fancy gay guys who had tons of talent and could go in between woman and man and explore the arts. And fashion is dead. Why did fashion die? It died because the gay guys left. Why are gay guys better than women at designing fashion? Because they're more daring and risk-taking. You could even say on a psychoanalytical level that the envy that the gay guy has towards the woman because she has a pussy and tits is actually the reason why it creates much more flamboyant and daring and beautiful dresses for her than she would ever do herself. Because if the gay guys left fashion, then you have these sort of risk-avoiding women taking over fashion. What do? They create everything beige the same year and the same year and the same year all over again. And fashion is now so boring that it's almost ready to kill itself. That's why fashion has fallen victim to SJWs and woke and tries to please you as a customer. No, fashion is supposed to piss you off and engage you. And finally, you realize you're so fucking attracted to that dress or that costume that you want to buy it because you want to become the person that you didn't dare to think you could be. That's what great fashion designers like Karl Lagerfeld did with fashion. Fashion is dead now, and it's going to take generations to repair the damage of all the gay guys who died. Just like Western Europe dealt with the damage done by millions of Jews being killed because Jews contributed richly as a shamanoid function within Western culture. And Europe lost most of them. They were killed or they went somewhere else. And that, I think, is an exact reason why Europe went so damn conservative and why radicality disappeared from European discourse and why women stopped giving birth to children. All these things that Western Europe suffers from today are a results of that. Just go to Belarus and Lithuania and realize how rich and fantastic these cultures were when they had proper Jewish cities in the midst of those cultures. But with all the Jews gone, they were, of course, prone to Soviet communism. And then are finally trying to get out of that with some kind of absurd pagan nationalism instead. It's going to take generations for them to find their soul again, because the soul is gone when the shamans and the androgynous are gone outside of culture.
Right. So in this formation of tribal poesis, I'm trying to imagine the map or think of a cartography for what this space looks like, because in the traditional world, look, it's so intuitive and so simple that people's minds seem to spontaneously go towards the area of, when I grow up, I'm going to be a man. If I'm a man, I'm going to find a woman. If I'm a woman, I'm going to find a man. There's going to be a nuclear family. We're going to have children. And this is going to be the basic structure of the family. And I think that a lot of people are failing to grow up because this image doesn't make sense anymore, coupled with the fact that they cannot imagine an alternative form of society. So if this intuitive image of basically the nuclear family is breaking apart and it doesn't make sense anymore, people have lost their faith in this image. And at the same time, it's so intuitive and simple, but we need something more complex. There's a problem of sort of, how do we think this alternative geography? And as far as I understand your thesis, there's an inner circuit and an outer circuit. So what I would expect to see and what I would expect to sort of co-create is that there is a core group of women who have a safe base, and then there's a kind of men on the peripheral who might like live in their own rooms but are kind of here sometimes, gone other times. They're out exploring, or they're gone away to, whatever it is. They're sort of, they're on their mission type of thing, or they're on their purpose, but they come back to the home base. So like, this gives me like the image of the commune as kind of with a matriarchal center, a matriarchal foundation, and there's kind of like an outer circuit. I'm just trying to imagine the map. I'm trying to imagine what does the space look like, or is it unmappable? Like, Because
No. You do culture studies to do that. So in the new book I'm writing with Jan Söderqvist right now, the process and event book that we're going to work on for another year, we just look at culture studies. We just look at different populations around the world and see who's the most successful. You can measure that with data. It's called wealth. It's called sense of freedom. It's called achievement, education, all those things you can measure. And it turns out that the Parsis of India and the Jews of Israel are by far the most successful ethnicities in the world. Also very successful are migrant populations. For example, the most successful immigrant population in America are Nigerian Africans. And they can't stand Afro-Americans who are SJWs because they're highly successful, they work hard, they get educated, and they're probably likely to be Christian Republicans when they arrive in America. So take, for example, America today. I think over the next 10 years, it'd be quite obvious that Christian Republicans who live in larger families, not nuclear families, they live in families where grandmothers and grandfathers take care of the kids too. So there are elders around. Now, Christian Republicans who live in Texas are probably going to save America this time around. And they're going to be Republicans, all of them. And they might be pissed off the Trump one because they actually trusted Trump because at least he was transparent. But they come up with something else 4 years from now. They probably control the Senate by then. And the Christian Republicans actually are the ones that live closest to the tribal poetical. They live closest to the sociant because they live in suburbs. You've got trees everywhere. It reminds you of the savannah. You've got a big house on your own, but it's no nuclear family. It's a larger family, which is much more sustainable. The nuclear family was invented by a Prussian bureaucrat in 1813, and he only wanted to hold Prussian citizens responsible for the actions. The intention was not to make you happy or to make you successful. And that's why the nuclear family failed. It was a farming reform in politics. It was not about finding a form that worked for humans. Family is always larger than mom, dad, kid. Always, in any culture I've studied. The nuclear family makes no sense to Indians, makes no sense to the Nigerians, makes no sense to Chinese, and that's why they're successful, because they have larger families that raise children properly to go through the educational process and become adults. So, tribal poetical today, for example, in America, would be Christian Republicans living in Texas. Why? They have a congregation. They unite around a religion. They go to church and they have church services and they have all kinds of activities throughout the week. And they're going to stay with that because they know by now that the alternatives, which is to live in the secularized America and move to San Francisco, New York, is a model that's completely falling apart. When they see the SJWs in the streets, they know, I'm going to stay Christian or Republican, that's a short. And I'm going to love my husband and I'm going to love my wife. And I don't want that. They know from Christianity that that's apocalyptic. That's not the future at all. That can only cause havoc and damage to society. So I would look at any culture and look at where do you find the tribal poetical and which cultures are the ones where it's been totally torn apart. In China, it was torn apart during the Cultural Revolution, and slowly China is trying to find its way back again because in China, they never caught on with individualism. That's the journey the Chinese are going through at the moment. It's going to be a long, hard journey for them because the damage done during the Cultural Revolution was absolutely massive on Chinese culture. It's easier in Japan, Korea, probably. The Indians are doing their own bit to this, and they're also learning from the West not to mimic certain things they don't like. So this is the global.
It seems to me that when it comes to theories of social construction, when it comes to the rejection of the traditional sort of family structure, there's this issue of thinking the intergenerational and thinking the developmental. So like if we're going to socially construct, like, because I think there is also a valid impulse to move away from, the traditional religions, and that they have kind of rotted from the inside. There's no more authenticity in them. I think that there is some authenticity to that motion. But I feel like in order to be a valid social construction of a new type of tribe, like the foundation, irrespective of the culture and irrespective of the historical tradition, has to embed social constructivity into the developmental process from birth to death on the one hand, and the intergenerational network, which includes the developmental process as a linked network. Because if you're just an individual without, like if I'm a 30-year-old guy and I don't have links to a 50-year-old and a 70-year-old guy, and I don't have links to a 20-year-old and a 10-year-old guy, then I lose perspective on my direction. I lose perspective on my process. And at the same time, if I'm creating an identity for myself as a 30-year-old guy, and I'm not situating my identity within the wholeness of my birth and death process, then I'm also sort of susceptible to getting lost in fantasy. So my foundation is to say, if we're going to be bold and brave and socially construct tribes, then the foundation for me has to be the developmental aspects and the intergenerational aspects. Does that make sense?
Yeah, but that is religion. You can't do without religion.
But
Martin Hägglund's an old friend of mine, the Swedish philosopher. But his latest book tries to create this fantasy, this sort of weird fantasy that you could create all these things without religion. He's kind of proud of being a secular atheist, and somehow he's going to create a civilized society, and at least he's going to get the Gnosticism out of the way. But all the things you discuss are complex, and the only way to put complexity into a form where it makes sense to people so they can follow it throughout their lives is what religion is. That's the name of it. Religion is what connects people with each other, what connects people with the ground, what connects people with the sky, what connects people with their own fate. And if you dissolve that, I don't think there's no atheist society. There's never been one. The only option after Christianity is either Gnosticism or paganism. And we fall into those two traps constantly.
Daniel Dennett's attempt to revive religion, or not to revive religion, but to include some aspects of religion in atheist community, and it totally fails. Daniel Dennett's attempt to sort of include religious symbolism in atheist conferences and stuff like that, it totally falls flat.
Yeah. But that's the problem with Jordan Peterson. Jordan Peterson is nothing but a Kantian moralist. And that's where you end up if you don't embrace religion fully. So it's like he's trying to build a huge building, but he has no ground for it. There's no basement to it. The basement is the actual faith. There must be a narrative that is credible. That's correct. But at least people now understand that you can't get rid of the building entirely because you have nothing else to fall back on. You don't have a root of the phallus, as we called it in our work. You don't have a deeper history, sense of history from where you come. And if you don't have that, you don't believe in anything. You can't build the future. You can't build the phallic in case you end up there. So there's something very castrated, constantly self-castrating about the pagans and self-castrating about these Gnostic attempts that we see today. They will all fail, and it will cost us enormously if we allow them to fail in public and take over politics and things like that. So we must become aware of these grand narratives earlier. Now, there are some people who think they can reform Christianity and Islam. I disagree. I think those religions are so flimsy in the original construct. That's exactly why they got so popular. That I think it's impossible to build something really lasting on Christianity and Islam. Although I certainly ally with Christians and Muslims today who do not want the return of paganism in society because they want to save their own families to start with. That's okay. But I think they're dysfunctional because they have a Gnostic foundation. So the Gnosticism they're trying to fight, it's actually a problem at the core of their own faiths. This was always the problem with Christianity and Islam. This was the problem of the West, essentially. So I go back to Zoroastrianism and Judaism, and I certainly study Taoism and Buddhism very, very seriously, because I think we need to go deeper into history, to older faiths, more complex systems that didn't go for popularity, that didn't promise you a life after death, these cheap sort of rewards you would get for going to church, but actually challenged you to live a full and complete life and then die with grace. That's what religion should do.
I mean, I think that there's some paradoxes here because, like on the one hand, you're saying that the Christian republics are closest to the sociant and that they are right to rebel against the SJWs and to see that as apocalyptic and stuff like this. And at the same time, you're saying, Christianity is rotten from within and that it can't be saved, kind of thing. So there is a need to think about new religion. There is a need to think about alternatives to Christianity and Islam. And I think that that's one of Europe's big problems as well, especially considering that Islam is sort of a force which doesn't seem to be going anywhere. And it's not like Christians in Europe are, strongly defending the tradition. There's probably more, religious pathos on the SJW side than the Christian side in Europe, for example. So there is a need to think new religion. And I'm just proposing this idea that in order to think new religion, we have to be able to think in the context of our own time, in the context of the 21st century as a totally different environment than anything we've ever experienced before, developmental and intergenerational logic. Because if we don't think developmental and intergenerational logic, we cannot socially construct. We have no ground to stand on. You're just building sort of a fantasy of your present moment.
Yeah, I agree. This is why we wrote the book Syntheism. John Sedekis and I. It exactly presents this argument you did. What we're doing now, though, is we're also looking deeper into history to see what we can learn from. And you probably remember that I said that the Christian Republicans in Texas are my best bet to save the United States right now, because the first people in America now who will discover that Google tries to manipulate your mind when you do Google search will be women in Texas. And they'll be furious about it because they don't want their children to go through that sort of manipulated process where the children are being taught to be woke through an algorithm. That is a really interesting conflict. So they're my best hope for America. But the two ethnicities in the world to be most successful for a long period of time are the Parsis of India and the Jews of Israel. And they never had a problem with capitalism. They didn't go for this sort of anti-capitalist rhetoric. They rather rode on it and became the wealthy and highly educated people they are. What they did, though, was that they have a really strong inner circuit.
Do you mean Farsi of Persia or Iran?
Parsi. The Parsi are the Zoroastrians of India.
Of India. Okay, because you said Parsi of Israel.
No, the Farsi is a language from Iran, but Parsi is originally the word for Iranians in India. So the Parsis in India came from Iran originally and were the Zoroastrian emigres who arrived in India, and they're by far the wealthiest, most successful ethnicity on the planet. They basically own half of India, and they still own 150,000. It's a very exclusive small group, but they're interesting to study because they're really strong inner circuit and a strong matriarchy. This whole talk about feminism never made sense to them because they've lived in a world where women were equally strong with men for 3,700 years. Feminism was not invented in the West. That's probably why it's so deranged, because the arrogant hasn't learned its own history. No, matriarchy is strong. Same thing in Israel. Women are very strong and they control the inner circuit, whereas the men overachieve in the outer circuit, which is what they do when they don't have to worry about the inner circuit. So you have strong matriarchy, strong patriarchy, and a high tolerance toward androgynous and shamanoid people. That is exactly what the tribal map says you should have in any population if you want to be successful. This is why we talk about the tribal singularity. And I think you should study the cultures that are the most successful on the planet, that seem to be the most resilient, that have been around the longest, before you start talking about the new religion. Because any new religion you discuss today has to arrive at a model of how you encourage the return of the tribe. And then, only then, can you build larger systems of that. And this is what's interesting. The only two reasonably functioning larger systems for populations that we've ever invented are called the nation and the empire. And who do you think invented those? The Zoroastrians of Iran or Persia invented the empire. The first proper empire that lasted for 2,200 years was the Persian Empire. And then later the Chinese tried to innovate and mimic it, and the Europeans tried to mimic it. The Roman Empire essentially was mimicking the Persian Empire all along. It even took its own military religion, imported it from Persia for the Roman army because it worked so well. Then within the Persian Empire, the Persians found an originally Hebrew sect coming out of Egypt that had very interesting ideas that rhyme very well with Zoroastrianism. The two-headed phallus and the matriarch. It is a triad system that we see in the US Constitution today that existed. The Persians invented it. The Jews took to it. They loved it. And therefore, the Persians sponsored the building of the Second Temple in Jerusalem. They paid the bill so the Jews could build the first proper nation within an empire, which is the origin of nationality. And the Jews are, of course, the perfect nation in the sense they're both a nation and a religion at the same time. This is why I think anti-Semitism in the Middle East and in Europe is essentially nation envy. Because anything that the Europeans and the Arabs tried to build, tried to mimic the perfect nation, was a Jewish one. But the secret of that was that both the religion and the nation were one and the same thing. That is the Jewish model. And that's why I love Judaism for it.
All right. Well, one of the interesting things for me about kind of your view of tribopoesis, or what I'm understanding of your view of tribopoesis, with the examples you're giving of the Parsi in India and the Jews in Israel, is that it's kind of an exclusive thing, and it's kind of a, it's not really accessible to the masses. These are small groups which form sort of very, tight inner networks, and is that it seems like what you're describing is probably not possible for most people. Or is that,
oh no,
am I getting it wrong?
Before the Prussian bureaucrats split the villages of Europe in the 1800s and made people very productive but also very unhappy, you had regular villages. And villages are essentially settled tribes. They're just tribes that stop moving and permanently settle and go into agriculture mode and raise cattle. And the vast majority of villages can be studied exactly as tribal poetical phenomena, and they usually work pretty well. And people live their lives and they go through these different phases at the appropriate time when they're ready for it. That made sense. And we built the Christian congregation of that. The most beautiful thing within Christianity is the idea of the congregation. What is the congregation? It is Christian tribal poesis. You find it again. You see the Saucion coming back. And the most successful people online today are not the ones that try to sell themselves all the time with drowning you in newsletters full of junk that you cannot even relate to and couldn't care less about. No, the people who send you junk all the time are the ones you throw in the spam box. You kill individualism literally through your own human, deeply biological behavior today. But what you're looking for is community. You look for these people who you can gather with, and we call them subcultures. And when I wrote the Netocrats of Jan Söderqvist 20 years ago, we said, at the end of the day, the internet is going to be the return of the tribe, because it's going to be the return of subcultures. Because when people can freely communicate wherever they want and turn off anybody they don't want to hear, which they can finally do, they will, after going through this sort of absurd supernova individualism, for example, influencers in the 2010s. Well, they've all failed now, right? What we're left with in the 2020s is the sense that I want to be part of a community. I want to be part of a chosen family of people I choose to live with. And I want to be part of a larger clan of people who are culturally connected with me, where some of them also disagree with my opinions, so I could grow and expand my mind. Now, that is how you healthily think of family, clan, and eventually tribe. So these forms are going to come back in a big way. That's going to happen naturally. We don't even have to make an effort for that to happen. We don't have to tell people, you must return to the tribe. That's what people naturally do, because that is the archetype they're born with. Now, the problem is another one. The problem is we are now 8 billion people on the planet. How can we be cosmopolitan? How can we mimic the shamans in a way that we can talk to strangers without wanting to kill them? That is the proper issue of racism. Now, once you can talk to a stranger and actually enjoy him, you don't care about his color or his face, then racism is over and done with, and the problem has been solved. Which the SJWs refuse to acknowledge, by the way, because they want to stay with the problem, because they make careers out of a problem that never can be solved, according to them. I think it's highly solved in many places, and most people actually couldn't care about skin color. But if you look at what people then do successfully, then we have to look at historically, what did we do over the last 4,000 years of history that worked? Which nations worked? Well, the Jewish one certainly did. And actually, every nation state in Europe is, because of Hegel, based on the Jewish nation as a model. Now, can empires work? Can we have systems that are so large and complex and have so many rules and things within them that we would actually trade successfully over large areas and within many populations without getting pandemics, without going into warfare, and without throwing nuclear missiles at each other? These are the issues that Derrida, Levinas, many of the philosophers, especially the Jewish ones of the 20th century, tried to address, because they didn't want to go back to the Second World War ever again, knowing that if they did it a third time, we would blow ourselves up permanently. So these issues of cosmopolitanism, they show how you solve the climate change problem. Ecotopianism, my response to that. These issues must be solved. And the only way to solve them is on the imperial level. And in that department, I think the United Nations is a joke. And I think the vast majority of empires today in the world are dysfunctional and wrongly run. So it's a hell of a job we have to do as philosophers to try to reinvent empire and nation. And that's how we reinvent religion. Because religion is what makes the impossible possible, by putting constraints on people so that within the religion, they can make the impossible possible. We can't do religion without thinking these things. That is what Derrida, Levinas, and the other guys addressed so well in the 20th century. And we owe it to them that we need to go back there and try to solve it again, using Hegel and Nietzsche more than anything, and stay between Hegel and Nietzsche as a pendulum, because I think it is between Hegel and Nietzsche that we can sort of solve the problems of the West. And one of them is to address the issue of the death of God and realize that God didn't die. We just brought the pagan gods back in. It was impossible for us to become atheists. It would be possible, of course, it was impossible for us to become individuals and individualists. It's the crappiest religion ever. We're not atoms. We're not alone. We're not polar bears. So I think this return to tribal that I'm fighting for and struggling for is the essential one. But we need to understand that we go back to tribal. The easy solution, what looks tempting to us, is to go back to the lynch mob and paganism. And that will be horrible in the world of 8 billion people.
All right. Well, I think what I'm taking away from this conversation is that philosophy today needs to be able to think the tribe. Philosophy today needs to be able to think new visions of nation, new visions of empire, new visions of large-scale human communities and how they function. I think that what's still missing for me, or not missing, but something that needs to be further explored, is the newness of our ecology or environment. Because, like, we're drawing examples from the ancient world and we're drawing examples from history, but it seems like, you know, this internet subcultures today are so primitive in comparison to the actual community, family, tribal networks that really had their teeth in the reel, so to speak. Whereas the digital communities today are kind of loose associations which you can join and leave with almost no regulations. They're, you know, they don't really have their teeth in the entire developmental identity, the whole intergenerational complex of a human being. I think people are kind of really in the, you know, the abyss or the desert, you know, like they're lost and they're dying to be sucked up by some, you know, entity that could help them build a networked identity in a real way. But there's, you know, there's huge issues here of, I think, sexuality, politics, economics, which people barely discuss, which people barely are willing to talk about directly. So maybe that's something we can pick up next time. But I'll definitely let you have sort of the final word on what you want the listeners to sort of take away from this first episode, and what you think the you know, what's food for thought for people who have tuned into this whole talk.
Yeah, you just pointed it out. A lot of the internet today is just full of children's diseases. People don't understand yet what they should do with the internet. But in that sense, I'm hopeful, because it is a very evolutionary environment. So you talked about communities, people can come and go as they wish. No, not any longer. It's rather that the communities that are thriving now look more like gated communities, and you have to swear some kind of loyalty to join and stay. You have to stay for quite considerable time, and you test it before you get to join. And this is, of course, a development that comes out of people getting tired of people walking in and out of things, because nothing really happened. Nobody stayed to actually create something valuable and sustainable. That takes hard work. So I think the ethics will turn in that direction, because at the end of the day, capitalism is still there. It was a massive force of nature that blew through society because it created tons of wealth on it. And that, I think, the difference between capitalism and attentionalism, which we're moving into now, is a really good topic for you and I to discuss. I'd love to develop that further with you, because you're working now with an attentionalist mindset. The world is different now. We operate through media. This is Marshall McLuhan, fundamentally. We operate through media, but these medias will eventually have to look much more fundamentally tribal and grounded. It's not the scrolling any longer. It's not the trolling any longer. It's not the jumping around and killing time. That is perfect underclass behavior. If you just sit and scroll and troll on the internet all day long, you will never build anything, neither for yourself or for people that you care about. So you need to go into something much deeper than that. And what I was inspired by when I wrote the Synthesis book was Burning Man. Now, that might look like a white privileged kind of culture. Well, it is, but it doesn't matter in this case because, again, it's a model that anybody can copy. But these sort of participatory festivals experiment with communism. But you build your own camp. And the camps are what? Clan size. The festival itself, tribe size. And it can even be larger tribes, and then it becomes nations. And it works. And they're flat organizations. Everybody's responsible for themselves. And you can't blame anybody else for shortcomings when you're there. You have a consent culture, certain rules that you must abide by to stay. But except for pulling electricity through the camps and somewhere to go and shit, the festival does not provide you with anything. You have to build everything yourself. So you essentially experiment with creating communist communes. And at least for 8 days, they seem to work quite brilliantly.
I think for me, I'm gonna have to exist on the outskirts. I'm gonna have to exist at a distance, and I'm gonna be happy that everything's going on, but I'll be writing by myself, just happy that the tribe is functioning. But
you are shamanoid, so you belong to the tribe of the shaman. They're their own tribe, but a smaller, looser one.
Shamans, I think.
Well, the only true individuals are the shamans.
There you go.
That's the honest truth.
The individual is undead. Maybe let's say. Let's go with that for now. I'm gonna close out this conversation, but this was a really good, I think, first attempt to get at tribal singularity. I want to remind the viewers how I started this live stream was really that I was interested in the technological singularity when I was a teenager. And I was blown away by the possibilities of the technologies that could come into my reality in my 40s and my 50s and my 60s. Like, oh my God, this is gonna be something I'm gonna experience. You know, it was a very believable narrative. And then what really motivated me, you know, as an academic was thinking the human aspect of it, thinking about the consequences for us as humans. And that's really what I want to sink my teeth into here. And thinking like, thinking the tribe in the context of singularity is massively thought-provoking. So I hope it's thought-provoking for you also. Thank you for Alexander Bard for joining me. And we will see you when we see you.